We want very much to focus in this next panel on the themes of climate change and energy security in a post-carbon world. So for the next 30 minutes, our panelists will examine how you prepare for a life in a drastically different world, where global warming and related environmental degradation will impact on security. We'll also try to explore the future of low-carbon alternatives and as we sustain climate-resilient economic development. So all in 30 minutes if we can. I'm joined here on stage by Nick Bridge, who is the Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change, a role he's held since 2017. It's also a pleasure to welcome Rear Admiral Michael Hewitt, the founder and CEO of IP3 to the forum. IP3 is an international energy and security company with the mission of bringing safe and secure nuclear power to the world's most critical markets. Eamon Ives is the Energy and Environmental Advisor at the Centre for Policy Studies, who specialises in energy and environmental policy and sits on the board of Climate Assembly UK. And I'm joined online by Elsa Palanza, the Global Head of Sustainability and ESG at Barclays, who drives the creation and implementation of the bank's policies and practices in regard to environmental stewardship and social impact. So welcome to you all, and let's dive straight in. So Nick Bridge, I'm going to ask you first. We just heard Bernard Looney there talking about his plans to make BP carbon-free by 2050. The UK has set the same ambition. How realistic is that really?
That's right, Samira. We were the first country in the world to have binding climate change legislation in 2008. And then last year we upgraded that 2008 first ever legislation to make it net zero by 2050. And as we heard before, that's not about sort of setting a target that has no meaning in the near term. That's something that is legislated and a statutory responsibility to deliver every 5-year carbon budgets that reduce our share of emissions. And we heard that we've now gone back to 19th century levels already. That is largely through our energy system. We had 40% coal in the UK just a few years ago. We went to zero most of the time in 5 years. So that scale of shift, how do we do that? That was because offshore wind came from being over £120 per megawatt hour to less than £40 per megawatt hour in less than 5 years. We're now the largest offshore wind producer in the world. So we've seen that we can do it in the energy system. We now need to look at all the other parts of the economy, transport, the way we use our land, grow our food, infrastructure, and all those other areas. So very challenging, but we will do it. There's a sort of phrase out there that you sometimes hear, must we do it, can we do it, and will we do it? And I'm happy to come back to some further elaboration of my thoughts on those questions.
Well, it's good to start with a kind of positive example of what actions are being taken by the UK government, but I want to take a step to a slightly bigger picture now, and I'll put it first to Michael Hewitt. So, the growth of China, India, these huge economic forces now, has shifted the major energy trade routes from west to east rather than the other way. Rapid growth in demand for energy globally at the same time that we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm wondering, what's in your mind is the connection between what we talk about as the climate emergency and the need for our collective security in relation to energy?
That's a great question, Samara, and I want to actually thank the forum for having the forethought to bring this energy conversation to bear, particularly when we look at the bilateral importance of this between the United States and the UK. And I think it's important to put this into perspective that we've got a population of 7 billion on the planet today. Over 1 billion have no electricity, rapidly moving to 10 billion people, of which 600 million in Africa today have no electricity. And so you realize as a national security issue and the instability that comes with that you really do need to address it, not just from what we would call levelized cost of electricity and balancing the energy mix with the desire to decarbonize, but you need to realize that many of these countries just need electricity. And with that comes prosperity and the kinds of things that hopefully from a military perspective, we could see less threats from. I think you look at the exponential growth of renewable power over the last decade, and it actually hasn't displaced 1 kilowatt of use of fossil fuel for electricity, simply because of population growth, and the demand curve for electricity is outpacing the conversion curve. And so I think it's incredibly important that we bring this into the private sector, into the commercial markets, And I think this idea of where GDP is moving and where populations are moving are critically important, because those of us from the Western civilization world, where our demand for power is fairly static and our ability to address our power needs is somewhat optimistic, many of these countries don't have that choice. And so we have to address both what our country's domestic role is and as well as our international role. And I would leave it with the fact that the United Kingdom can follow net zero, and the United States can follow its carbon zero policies, and collectively we move the climate change curve back about 6 years. So ultimately we have to address the global perspective of climate change and not simply our own domestic objectives.
This is something that resonates very much with the public as well, I think, this idea that what's the point of, I'm just putting myself into the voice of, say, a typical British citizen who might think, what's the point of the UK doing anything when China and India and Brazil and all these countries that are much bigger seem to be going the opposite direction? I don't know, if you want to take that on, Nick, first, and then ask the other panellists for their thoughts on how we see that picture and our responsibility within it.
Well, first, if you want cheaper energy, more secure energy, cleaner energy, then you're doing it for your own self-interest. I think it's very important that this shift I just described in the UK has led to cheaper energy. So we are not doing it out of just global responsibility and leadership, but for our own economic interest. If you want livable cities, if you want clean air, if you want good health, if you want to move around your societies in a more enjoyable way, for all these reasons. 5 years ago we signed the Paris Agreement because multilaterally and as countries we realized we had a problem and we committed to dealing with it. But 5 years on, it now makes economic and financial sense to do it, not just diplomatic and political sense. So, the second thing, though, quickly is, if you do want to achieve change in China and in India, more than half the emissions reductions will have to come out of China. You don't just sit there and do nothing. As a diplomatic position, you must have a strong story to tell, and you must understand also the self-interest of the countries you're engaging with. So in both those respects, that's why we've got net zero, that's why we're hosting COP, but it's also very much in China's self-interest to move rapidly to a cleaner and more affordable system more rapidly.
Before I bring in the other panelists, I just want to go back to Michael Hewitt to say, we know that there are fragmented trade relations. So how do we tackle the problem of dwindling resources, which to some extent are an issue, and become less dependent on countries like China and Russia for our energy supplies, even allowing for all the developments in things like wind energy?
Well, I come at it from a perspective of nuclear power, and realizing that the nuclear power provides the key attributes that I think we need to address, such as baseload, resiliency, and obviously clean. And those are the things that invite manufacturing. And when you look at big data centers and major manufacturing, they're going to want that baseload power. And so when you look at the development of the nuclear power industry, and I come at it from the perspective that the United States and the United Kingdom, as the two countries that created this industry and had a vision, atoms for peace and those things, could see where this kind of energy source was critical for population growth. And in many ways now, what we have is Russia and China dominating this energy market. And so the question really on the table is, as a matter of decarbonizing and as a matter of clean, are you comfortable with Russia and China being the resource providers for that? And for wind and solar, I would probably not put a premium on that. But for nuclear power, I would put a premium on that. And so that's really how I would address this concern of the growing markets. And again, they are the biggest polluters, India and China, in many ways. And China is also the biggest developer of nuclear power. So in some way, they will tell you that they are actually the country that is addressing climate change in a much more robust fashion than we are.
They've just made a big announcement, haven't they, about green policy, which was interesting
timing. $60 billion
timing.
announcement that they are going to decarbonize the planet. So, right.
Let me bring in the business angle then. Elsa Palanza, what role should businesses play in both in dealing with this kind of trade-off between security and energy supply, and indeed in thinking about that transition to a low-carbon economy? How far are businesses genuinely playing a major role in this?
Sure. Thanks, Samira. And I'm sorry I'm not there with you all. It would be much more fun to be there in person. Well, I think fundamentally, when we think about the role of business, there's no doubt that every leg of the stool, so to speak, needs to play its own role. I think we've talked about the role of government, no doubt, in creating an enabling environment for business to make the transition that it needs to make. But the private sector as drivers of the economy, and then certainly the financial sector as effectively the stewards of that private sector, need to play a critical role in making this happen. I think we need to think about sort of two sides of this conversation. There's the risk equation, and then there's the innovation and opportunity side of the conversation. On the risk side, I think there's two elements of this as well. Fundamentally, climate change and energy insecurity pose a financial risk to companies, certainly to banks such as ours, not only thinking about things like stranded assets from a potential transition risk, but certainly as we've seen, even just in the last year, the amount of physical risk posed by climate change for supply chains and certainly for sort of physical assets in situ. And so thinking about both those forms of risk being posed to a private sector entity is a critical part of the risk calculation that needs to be had. There's another side of that, though, which is really effectively the social contract. And I think this cannot be downplayed. I think it's problematic just to refer to it as a reputational issue. Fundamentally, all of our stakeholders, not just our investors, but the public at large, our consumers, our clients, our neighbors, are expecting more of the private sector, and more one's social contract is going to be dependent on whether or not you're seen to be participating in a proactive, pro sort of climate positive agenda, or perhaps not, in which case you will be written out of the story pretty quickly when it comes to stakeholder engagement. I think the other side of that's important is what I mentioned about innovation and opportunity. When we think about the energy space in particular, it's going to take both. I think the nuclear conversation is a really interesting one. This is not a new technology, but there's new innovation around it constantly that can be brought up. There's a lot of excitement around the hydrogen economy right now, and I think that holds a lot of promise, but still is pretty far off. So the question is, how can we both steward these new nascent technologies while recognizing that it can't just be new technology that will solve the problem? We also have to be providing transition finance and transition support to current companies and current supply chains to make the transition that they need to low carbon business models. So I think hearing from BP at the start of this was a perfect example of that. They fundamentally needed to learn how to transition their whole model, and it's going to be a gradual process. But we need those big players as part of the equation in order to provide the energy we need while also seeing that transition to low carbon models happen.
Thank you so much. I wanted to do one specific follow-up, and I don't know if Eamon, you want to take this. I'm interested in how significant the hydrogen economy might be to the green recovery.
Yeah, it's certainly a sector which has attracted a good deal of attention lately, and I like to think I played a small part in that. We published a paper earlier this summer looking at the role that it could play in decarbonising heavy transport. So I think a lot of people look at kind of batteries and things for maybe smaller cars than sort of the family cars you'll be driving. However, at something the scale of a bus or a truck or even heavier than that, maybe a ship, there's kind of question marks about the limits that batteries can do there. So that's kind of why we were looking at hydrogen as this potential kind of energy source to power those types of transport, and then perhaps, utilize it in heating or industrial processes, which we still we made good progress on, but there are still people kind of looking for potential other solutions there, rather than a kind of a full electrification. So I think certainly it's something, and it seems like something the government is definitely kind of latched onto as well. So I think there's definitely some green shoots of optimism in the hydrogen economy, and it's going to be up to the sector itself to kind of compete with batteries and electrification in that regard. But I think it's going to be a really interesting one to look at over the next sort of 10, 20 years.
Okay. Next question. I'm going to start with you again, Eamon, but I'd like all the panelists to respond to this. the thing about COVID-19 is when the lockdown first happened, certainly in the UK, there did seem to be a genuine sense of perhaps we are going to have a major rethink about how we live lives and how we consume energy. And yet, very quickly, it became plastic bottles everywhere, plastic gloves, plastic everything. And so soon after, it had felt like a tide had turned in the public mood to rethink our use of plastics. It feels potentially like we might be going backwards. And I wondered what your thoughts all are on the challenges countries face in implementing a green economic recovery, given what COVID-19 has done to us. Maybe Eamon, take that first.
Yeah, so I think particularly from a kind of a UK focus, when we kind of shift back to those first couple of weeks where we really were locked down, where you could only go out once a day, and it would probably be the best part of your, your 24 hours. I think people really did latch on to how actually quite enjoyable it was to not be breathing in horrible polluted air. I live in London, I'm sure many other people here do as well, and it was actually quite nice to kind of not be competing with traffic, and people did twig that, you know, maybe there is a better alternative, and what can we do to achieve that? So could we potentially look at kind of housing density regulations and things like that to allow us to kind of all live a little bit closer, so we don't need to rely on cars to get from A to B. You know, we could do more walking, more cycling. It could make public transport a bit of a more attractive option. And I'm generally pretty optimistic that those sort of patterns are going to become embedded in how we kind of live our lives going forwards. There are certainly some downsides, and we see kind of the plastic masks and things like that. Yeah. But I think in general terms, there was kind of that recognition that, you know, we don't necessarily need to kind of go back to the bad old days.
Okay, so same question in a weird way to you, Nick Bridge. What are the big barriers in terms of a green recovery from COVID-19? What have you noticed have been the new challenges, perhaps?
Well, I think the first thing is never waste a crisis. It's an absolutely appalling crisis, particularly for the poorest and most vulnerable. Michael mentioned the hundreds of millions of most vulnerable people who are already suffering these staggering climate and extreme weather crises and now hardest hit by COVID. So it's massive in different ways everywhere, but never waste it. I mean, it's remarkable to me how quickly we've built the narrative of Build Back Better. And that's because of the science and the economics. We cannot meet the climate goals that we must meet to avoid catastrophe if we don't build back in a different way. We just don't have the carbon budget left. So this is a point of reset. And as the COVID crisis goes on, I think it's given us a bit of time. And I'm hearing quite a common voice coming across from the IMF, the World Bank, leading countries. It's also given us a bit more time as we've had to push back COP to get the kind of movement going and the diplomacy moving. We've seen the China announcement. We'll now see what might happen in the US, and we've got other countries starting to come on board and raise ambition. So it's about using the time to lock in the reality that we have no choice but to fundamentally do things differently. And I come back to my first point, which is it's now cheaper to do it differently. It's cheaper to be cleaner. So it's about getting the grit in the economic system and the financial system to shift fast enough with enough urgency and enough scale. By 2030, we have to have roughly halved the world's emissions at a time where we're actually still going up. And that's the goal of COP. You know, halfway towards 2030, we've got to have shown in the next 5 years that we've bent that curve very significantly. We have to use the COVID crisis to build that narrative and that sense of common cause.
Elsa, what's your view on the barriers that countries face in terms of recovery from COVID-19, a green recovery?
Well, I don't need to repeat. I would agree absolutely with my colleagues on stage around the comments that they've made. I think fundamentally when we're thinking about this from the financial point of view, there is a huge desire to play a part in this. I think when we think about not only the recovery financing necessary to get the full economy back on its feet, but then when you magnify that by the amount of finance that's going to be needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals and to meet net zero, if one has made that commitment. And then broadly, if you take into account the Sustainable Development Goals, even in a more broad context, fundamentally, there's trillions of dollars on the table that is needed. And you have a really hungry and capable finance sector who's ready to plug in. It's just a matter of making sure that those conduits connect the dots. And so this is where there's an opportunity and a real need for us to work together across sectors. There needs to be an enabling environment, both from a policy perspective, but also from a de-risking perspective, thinking about what policy positions could be put in place by country governments to enable that finance to flow and also to de-risk it. Fundamentally, some of the needs that are coming up are not necessarily going to be answered by traditional forms of financing or by traditional investment. And so we need to make sure that if we have opportunities for stacked finance or blended finance, we can really leverage that to meet the sort of immediate small, medium, and large-term investment needed to make that happen.
Michael Hewitt, you obviously have a particular interest in nuclear power, and it struck me there was that point, I can't remember how many years ago, when Germany made this decision, because I think they'd had, was it after Fukushima, to say, right, we're going to close all our nuclear power stations, and of course coal usage went up dramatically. It seemed to be an interesting contradiction in a country that was in many ways a leader of green thinking. How far is thinking about the way forward and green energy realigning broadly with traditional allies, and how far are there kind of significant points of difference? And if I can add to that, then how much does that make it harder to make the advances we're talking about needing?
Well, it's a great question, and I just want to pick up on this idea of this is a wonderful opportunity for us to address all these issues, because it's at the top of everybody's attention. And I look at NATO, I look at the United States, I look at the UK. There's no debate about whether climate change is a national security issue or not. So when you're inviting in the thinking of a NATO and others to look at the NATO nations and talk about decarbonizing as a national security imperative, well, you don't solve that by putting 2% of your GDP just into military hardware. So if we're going to invite NATO nations to decarbonize, and we are, and many of the EU nations are really being compelled to decarbonize, and we're associating it with national security, what a wonderful opportunity to tie those two things together and resource the solution, not just have policies that direct the solution. I think Germany's a great test case here, where they decided to get out of nuclear power. They actually produce more carbon than they were before, and they're going to become dependent upon a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so the question geopolitically is, are you comfortable with that from an energy sovereignty perspective? And ultimately, I would question that. And so I think as we invite our allies together to look at this issue of decarbonization, when we need much more electricity, not less electricity, and recognizing that there are areas that don't have the opportunity to look clean first, but I think, as Bernard said, there's a wonderful opportunity to deliver clean with baseload at the beginning. And the other thing that we have under this crisis is inviting in the private sector. I appreciate the issue on financing, because I do believe that we can create investable opportunities for clean energy across the spectrum of renewables and nuclear power and other clean energy solutions. And in many ways, if you look at the space industry and what you now have being driven by the private sector with Elon Musk and Branson and Bezos and others that were invited into the problem of a government-led space industry that was really defunct, and in many ways we're becoming more and more dependent upon the Russians in particular. They completely changed the industry around into one that's commercially driven and profit-making. I truly believe that in the renewable energy and the nuclear power space, we're going to find innovation to be the key. And so I am, like the other panelists, very excited about the opportunity to raise this issue.
Can I ask how much anxiety there is about reliance in the short term still on Russian energy? One gets a sense that it'll be some years before many countries might have viable alternatives that could sustain them through, the deepest of winters, for example. I don't know if, Nick, you want to take that first, but what's the thinking about a transition period to a more secure future on energy?
Well, I think the main thing and the focus around COP is understanding the long-term point that we all need to get to, and that's where businesses, including BP, but many others, are calling for that long-term certainty. That's how we got the net zero legislation through, is that civil society wanted it and business wanted it. So we have a direction of inevitable travel, and the risks of not getting there are too great to contemplate. But there is, as you say, that transition. I think, as Michael said, the actual amount of fossil fuel in the system has not gone down. It's just that the renewables has gone up.
Specifically, how many countries are actually entirely dependent on that tap? And if if it was turned off, suddenly you'd have whole populations without energy?
Well, it's not about turning it off, it's about the urgency and the scale and pace at which you transition. And I think you just need to look at the energy markets over the last year to look at how quickly things can shift, but how you can sustain security and affordability of your energy systems. So, gas is half as polluting as coal. As I described how coal had dropped out of the UK, just like that. In our power generation. So there's that capability everywhere, and renewables is something that can be done everywhere. But it takes grid, it takes investment, it takes the regulatory system, the incentive system to price the pollution or the fossil fuels properly. So there's a whole suite of answers, around the technical side, the regulatory environment, the investability in that country by business, getting the financial system to de-risk and putting the projects together. A massive, massive, complex problem, but it's got to happen at a scale and a pace that we've never seen. And we're just beginning to see we know it has to be done. We've seen the beginnings of it happening in some markets, but it's now got to happen everywhere.
And Elsa, people will be thinking about a country like Brazil, to some extent, with some of the deregulation around environmental protection that's happened in the United States, and might think very sudden decisions, depending on political leadership, can have quite a large impact on the long term of a green recovery. What's your thought about operating in that global picture when governments can have such a large part to play?
Well, I'd say that there's no doubt that the government intervention or lack thereof has a huge role to play. But I will say that the financial markets are moving even without that intervention. There's no doubt that the trend is moving only in one direction, which is a great thing. Fundamentally, I'd say that you see a lot of the progress happening first in the European markets and the adjacent UK markets when it comes to financial systems embracing the concept of climate change as a financial risk and needing to account for that. But our colleagues in the United States are absolutely making moves and to think about Paris alignment trajectories and also net zero goals. And we're seeing that happen. There's a myriad number of tools that we're all using to make those calculations. And we do need to see harmonization across the full global industry in order to make that happen more consistently and in a more harmonized fashion. But fundamentally, I'd say that the risk factors that I mentioned at the start, both from a purely financial perspective and also from a societal engagement perspective, are true and are managing to make movement happen even without the added incentive of governments. Now, you can only go to a certain point and at a certain point of the wrong things, meaning sort of heavy fossil fuel industry is being heavily subsidized, whereas a green trajectory is not, you do run into certain hurdles. But I'd say that this is all moving in one direction fundamentally. And so I think we're seeing a good amount of progress that's being driven largely by the markets, even without the government intervention.
Final question to you, Eamon, in a short amount of time we have left, which is, you gave a great example with hydrogen of how putting this idea out there kind of creates a momentum around people then thinking they could make it happen. What's your overall view on what's the key to getting more investment in clean energy and infrastructure? Because everyone's made the case for why it makes economic sense. What's the key to making it happen?
2 words: carbon tax. I'd be incredibly supportive of carbon tax. I think we dreadfully under tax pollution, and I think it's something that the public are on board with in principle. A lot of polling suggests that. The Climate Assembly, which I sat on as an advisory member, essentially came to that conclusion. And I think people are kind of waking up. If there's one thing people don't like in politics, it's unfairness. And I think people are starting to wonder, why should these kind of big energy companies get off from paying for the damages which they are causing right around the world? Obviously, it's got to be sensible, it's got to be phased in, it's got to be manageable. But I think, price on pollution would be one of the best things we could have, and hopefully we'll get some more action on that at COP26 next year.
I love a 2-word solution to a question.
I then put a lot more at the end of it.
No, you did. Thank you. Thank you so much to all my panellists on what I think is, in a way, that the one theme that's emerging in every discussion through the day, which is the impact of climate emergency on our security and the need to take action now. We're now going to take our second networking break of the day. So everyone online, please do use this time to make use of the platform's networking functions. And we'll be back in 20 minutes when I'll be talking to Cathy Warden, the CEO of Northrop Grumman. Thank you.